Hey! So here's a thing that'll ruin your afternoon. Your run handles 3,847 tokens, fine. Then at 4001 CUDA out of memory. Same model. Same GPU. Same code. You didn't touch anything. And here's the part that gets me, that crash wasn't random. It was inevitable from token 1. Let me show you why. 3,847 tokens, fine. 4001 tokens, CUDA out of memory. Same model. Same GPU. Same code, you didn't touch a thing between those two runs. Nothing crashed for the first 4,000 tokens of that conversation, and then it just did. Feels like a bug, right? It isn't one. So your first instinct is a memory leak. Fair guess. That's when a program grabs memory, loses track of it, and never hands it back. The space stays claimed with nothing using it. Do that enough and there's nothing left. And the crash came out of nowhere, so something must be piling up, right? Because that memory was never leaked. It was requested. On purpose. By code doing exactly what it was designed to do. Turns out 6 different things are allowed to ask your GPU for space at the same time, and they all have a legitimate claim. Nobody's misbehaving. They're just sharing a card that isn't big enough for all of them at once. And some of them don't stay the same size. Here's the split that explains everything. Your weights? 15.2 gigabytes, and they don't budge whether the conversation is 10 tokens or 10,000, that block sits there, exactly the same size. But training activations and the KV cache grow with every single token you add. So they creep right, and eventually they touch the line your card can't cross. Same code. Just more tokens. First, what a model actually is, a pile of learned numbers. That's it. Qwen 2.5, beholds 7.61 billion of them. Once training's done, they're locked, fixed, unchanging. And every last one has to sit somewhere the GPU can physically reach. That's non-negotiable. Now, what goes into that pile? Your text becomes tokens. Roughly 3/4 of a word each, so 4 words gives you about 3 tokens. The model never sees letters, never has. It only sees a sequence of these things. And hold on to that word, sequence, because its length is about to matter enormously. Now watch what happens to each token. Every token travels through the same stack, 28 times over. Qwen 2.5, 7b stacks 28 layers, and each one refines every token a little further. Which means nothing that costs memory in one layer stays small by the time you reach the end. It multiplies. And each pass leaves something behind. Every one of those 28 layers leaves scribbles behind. Half-finished results, temporary, not part of the model. And here's the part that got me. At a batch of 4 with 2048 token sequences, those notes run about 16.4 gigabytes. The weights are 15.2. The rough working outweighs the model. Training pays 5 tenants. Weights. Activations. Gradients. Optimizer states. Framework overhead. That's the bill. And notice what's missing, no KV cache. Training sees the entire sequence at once, all of it, in one go, so there's nothing to cache between steps. That slot just doesn't exist here. Which is interesting, because Inference has a completely different problem. Inference pays 4. Weights, still there, unavoidable. Framework overhead, still there. Activations, present, but much thinner. And then the KV cache shows up as a brand new tenant. But look what's gone, gradients and optimizer states, just vanished. Nothing's being learned during inference, so the 2 most expensive training tenants don't exist. Which sets up a nice little rule. 6 tenants total. But no single workload pays for all 6. Training skips the KV cache entirely, it sees the whole sequence at once. Inference drops gradients and optimizer states, the 2 priciest ones. And here's why that matters. Every optimization later targets one specific tenant. Know its column, and you know if it helps you. Quick note on where these numbers come from, because it matters. Every figure here comes from the published architecture config and the named training stack. Straightforward arithmetic, multiplication and addition, nothing fancy. None of this was profiled on a live running job. It's a bill you can compute on paper before you ever launch. Running total starts at 0. 6 distinct objects, all competing for the same VRAM. Weights, activations, gradients, optimizer states, CUDA cache, framework overhead. And an out-of-memory error is just this, the active ones adding up to more than the card holds. That's the whole mechanism. Which means the first question is never why did it crash, it's which of these 6 are actually active right now. Tenant 1. Model weights. The unavoidable baseline. All 7.61 billion learned parameters have to be loaded into VRAM before the model can do anything at all. In BF16, that's 2 bytes per number, 7.61 billion times 2 gives you 15.2 gigabytes. Fixed. Doesn't budge. This is the floor for every single operation, training or inference. And that floor is higher than you'd think. Take AT4. 16 gigabytes of memory, which sounds fine until you drop 15.2 gigabytes of weights into it. That's the whole card, gone. A sliver of headroom left, and you haven't done anything yet, no forward pass, no batch, nothing. 5 more tenants still want a piece of that sliver. Starting with the one that grows. Tenant 2, activations. These are the model's rough working, the half-finished results every layer produces on the way to an answer. During training you can't throw them away, because figuring out what to fix means looking back at what each layer actually computed. So they all get kept. 28 layers worth. And the way they scale is nasty. The dominant activation cost lives inside attention, and it's the attention score matrix shaped sequence by sequence. Square. Which already tells you something's about to go wrong. And it's worse than it looks, because there's one of these per attention head, per layer. Written out, the whole thing is batch times heads times sequence squared times bytes. Let's plug in real numbers. Qwen 2.5, 7B at a sequence length of 8,192. That's 28 heads, times 8,192 squared, and squaring is where it explodes, times 28 layers, times 2 bytes. Run that multiplication and you get over 100 gigabytes. For the score tensor alone. Next to the 15.2 gigabytes of weights, that's absurd. Which is exactly why nobody actually builds it. Modern fused attention kernels compute attention without ever materializing that full tensor. They calculate what they need and discard it on the fly, so the giant grid never exists in memory at all. Real measured usage comes in dramatically lower than the naive formula suggests. That's a weirdly elegant fix. But it does leave us with one awkward line in the accounting. Here's something worth flagging. 5 of these 6 are just arithmetic, parameter count times bytes, done. Activations aren't. They depend on which attention kernel runs, how many tensors the framework saves for the backward pass, whether checkpointing's on. So treat that number as the right order of magnitude. Not a figure to budget to the decimal. Here's the shape of the problem. Double your sequence length, and that attention score matrix doesn't double, it quadruples. It's a sec-squared term. Modern fused kernels never actually build that tensor, so you won't see the full cost allocated. But the formula still matters. It tells you which knob turns a slowdown into a crash. Activation memory scales linearly with batch size. Batch-dependent saved activations grow roughly 1-to-1, so batch of 8 is about an 8 times multiplier for that component, same setup. Linear. Predictable. Boring, in a good way. So, batch of 4, sequence of 2048, Qwen 2.5, 7B stores around 16.4 gigabytes of activations. Put that next to the weights. It's bigger, more than the model itself. Stack it up. 15.2 gigabytes of weights plus 16.4 of activations gives you 31.6 gigabytes. And just like that, the T4 is out, and so is the 24 gigabyte A10G. Both gone, 2 tenants in. This is the first tenant that isn't fixed. Weights didn't care how long your conversation was, activations do. And we haven't touched training yet. Tenant 3, gradients. A gradient answers one question for each parameter. If you nudge this number up a tiny bit, does the prediction get better or worse, and by how much? Direction plus magnitude. During the backward pass, the model computes one of these for every trainable parameter, sweeping backward through the whole network. One per parameter. so do the multiplication. Backward past time, every trainable parameter gets its own gradient. All 7.61 billion of them. And these are stored in FP32, for bytes each, because tiny gradient values would just round away to nothing in BF16, stability wins. So 7.61 billion times 4 is 30.4 gigabytes. Double what the weights cost. Running total, 62 gigs. Your 40 gig A100? Gone. Notice the word trainable. A parameter you've frozen produces no gradient at all. Which means it costs nothing here. 0. That's not a rounding trick, it's a genuine loophole in the accounting. Park it for now. Because the running total just got ugly. Weights plus activations plus 30.4 gigabytes of gradients, 62 gigabytes. The A140 gig is gone. An 80 gigabyte card is now your floor, and we're 3 tenants in out of 6. Fixed again, 1 gradient per parameter, but fixed at double the weights because of FP32. And we still haven't hit the expensive one. Your gradient points somewhere. Great, but how far do you step? That's the optimizer's job. Atom, the standard for training these things, answers it per parameter by tracking 2 running averages, roughly, which way that parameter's been drifting, and how erratic it's been. 2 numbers, every parameter. Hold that thought, it gets expensive. And each one stores a number for every single parameter. Which makes each of them a full-size copy of your model. Momentum, 7.61 billion times 4 bytes, 30.4 gigabytes. Variance, same again, 30.4. Together that's 8 extra bytes per parameter, 60.9 gigabytes. 2 full-size shadow copies of the model, just sitting there. For times the weights. And we're not done. Training also keeps a separate FP32 master copy of the weights. Not part of Atom's own state, it's a second piece of the mixed precision layout this whole series assumes. Another 4 bytes per parameter, 30.4 gigabytes. Add it to the optimizer states and you're carrying 91.3 gigabytes beyond the weights, purely for step sizing machinery. 6 times what the BF16 weights cost. 6 times. For deciding how far to move. Stack that 91.3 gigs on top of weights, activations, and gradients, and you're at 153.4 gigabytes. For a model that's 15.2 gigs. One line ago an 80 gig A100 still worked, now it's crossed out. And this is where the full parameter run dies. On the Tenant nobody budgets for. Tenant 5, the KV cache. Inference only. To produce the next word, the model looks back over everything said so far, and rather than re-deriving the entire conversation from scratch on every single step, it keeps what it already worked out about each token and reuses it. That store is the KV cache. And it never stops growing. Every token adds to it. And every simultaneous user gets their own copy. Notice the KV cache isn't in that 153.4 gigabytes. That's deliberate. Training sees the whole sequence at once, so there's nothing to cache. But at inference? This thing goes from 0.12 gigabytes to 60 on the same model. That's the next video. Last tenant, and it's the one nobody budgets for. CUDA's own context takes roughly 300 to 500 megabytes. Then CUDA's workspace, PyTorch's caching allocator, kernel compilation buffers, serving engine state. Together, 1 to 8 plus gigabytes of pure tax. It's also where fragmentation lives, free space scattered in pieces too small to actually use. Running total? About 158 gigabytes. For a 15.2 gigabyte model. Add it up. About 158 gigabytes for a model whose weights are 15.2. Look at that tiny block next to the tower. 4 of these tenants hold steady no matter what, weights, gradients, optimizer plus master copy, framework overhead. 2 don't. Activations, and off to the side, the KV cache. Those 2 are your crash. Same model, for different jobs, and the bill swings from about 18 gigs to over 150. Inference is the cheap one, no gradients, no optimizer. Full parameter training pays for everything. And LoRA and QLoRA? They sit way down here, because most of the model stays frozen and a frozen parameter produces no gradient, so it costs nothing. That's the whole trick. So, the shape of the whole thing. For tenants are fixed, weights, gradients, optimizer states, framework overhead. Set your config, and they don't move an inch. 2 grow with every token, 1 per mode. Training activations. And the KV cache during inference. That's the split. Everything in this series comes back to it. And you've only properly met one of those 2 growing ones. Remember that 6th tenant we skipped? The KV cache. At 1 user, short context, it's 0.12 gigabytes, a rounding error. Now stretch the conversation to 32K tokens and put 32 people on it at once. Same model, same weights, 60 gigabytes. That's the whole next video. So that's the whole thing. Weights, activations, gradients, optimizer states, KV cache, overhead, add up the ones your workload actually pays for, and that's your VRAM bill. The out-of-memory error was never a bug. It was arithmetic you hadn't done yet. If pulling systems apart until they stop being mysterious is your kind of fun, subscribe for the rest of the series.